refer to imaginary creatures in general, dragons and unicorns and Yaramayahoos, but most of the people who consider themselves cryptozoologists would take serious issue with that. Cryptozoologists' core interest, indicated by the etymology of the word, is the study of quote-unquote hidden animals, animals that may or may not exist. And if you're going to come up to me and tell me that basilisks are objectively real, then I'm just going to stop you right there. So basically, this next step on the belief grade is monsters that some people believe exist and other people do not. And by other people, I of course mean almost everyone. Now, it's easy to make fun of cryptozoology, and that's why I do it. It's easy. But I do try not to do it with people having the actual sightings. I mean, some of them are maniacs, and some of them are liars, and some of them watched the Bigfoot episode of The $6 Million Man and got confused, but a lot of them are perfectly earnest. They are often reported as such in the literature, and being, as I am, one of Minnesota's top 20 monster comedians, there was a paper? I don't know. People actually sometimes come to me with their own cryptozoological stories, and they don't want publicity and they don't want an explanation, they just want a sympathetic ear. Now, there is not any really good scientific evidence for Bigfoot, and such an animal does not fit well into its proposed ecologies. Its evolutionary precedents are absent, and so on. And as a result, I personally do not think there is a good scientific case for its existence. But I do know a number of people who I believe genuinely think they have seen one, and I'm not really comfortable saying that they're wrong. The way I reconcile these two things is by not reconciling them. I don't know the answer. Right now I'm curious about possibilities involving human perception and visionary experience, but in the meantime, I would love nothing more than to hear about the chupacabra you saw one time. I've written this talk so that the $6 Million Man Bigfoot stays on screen as long as possible. With the cryptozoologists themselves, the people writing the books and making the shockingly terrible television shows, I am, as you may have already detected, somewhat less sympathetic. Now, this is not exclusively because of an unfortunate tendency to take a light rustling in the woods as concrete evidence of an undescribed but enormous species of hominid. Though, Lord, there is that. Really, it's more of an upgrading of this same tendency into theory that can get troubling. Take, for example, the Loch Ness Monster, which of course is generally held to be a surviving plesiosaur. The problems with this theory are numerous. Plesiosaurs were air breathers, which means we'd see them more. Their necks weren't sufficiently flexible to raise out of the water. Loch Ness doesn't have the biomass to support an entire species of large animals, and I'm just going to toss this in, plesiosaurs have been extinct for 65 friggin' million years. And in every single cryptozoology book, they talk about the coelacanth, which was thought to have been long extinct until they started fishing them out of the waters of Madagascar, which was the more shocking because what they wanted was tuna. And yes, this does prove the point that the fossil record is incomplete. You bet it is. But it is not, in fact, garbage. It does, in fact, give us a general idea of prehistory. I mean, you've got plesiosaurs, 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 planet-killing rock from outer space. No plesiosaurs, no plesiosaurs, no plesiosaurs. And this means something. So basically, at the end of the day, plesiosaur is the worst possible animal explanation for the Loch Ness Monster, but it's exciting, and it sticks. The world of unexplained phenomena is replete with this sort of thing. Weird lights in the sky. Okay, tell me more. They're alien spacecraft. Okay. Poltergeist. Something flies across the room unexpectedly, and the default assumption is that the human soul exists, it survives the death of the body, and it creates kinetic power without mass. That is not Occam's razor. That is the opposite of Occam's razor. That is Occam's Miracle Grow hair tonic. And the cryptozoologists should really be staying away from this sort of thing if they want to be considered scientists, which they do. They've got ologists right there in the name. A while ago, they published a scholarly journal for a few years. It had a dull blue cover and charts inside of it, the works. But the scientific community has not embraced them. They lack the reproducible results to be zoology and the analysis of sociology and storytelling to make them folklorists. Some proper zoologists have pursued cryptozoology and applied what rigor they could to it, but suffice it to say, they have generally done this after receiving tenure. But the field is plagued by a lack of rigor, which is a shame, because science is good. Science gave us the Cassini probe and a polio vaccine and taco-flavored Doritos. Let's do science when we can, but let's go ahead and do it right, okay? And certainly you have, for every professor with a hobby, a number of cryptozoologists who take the pseudoscience and just ladle out the pseudo. Pseudo. That was a super dumb joke exclusively for old people. But I wrote it down and I delivered it. One group of cryptozoologists is, in recent years, the creationists have started getting into cryptozoology, feeling that the small sauropods reported unreliably in the African jungle, or the pterosaurs appearing infrequently in Indonesia, prove that the Bible is true. And the series of logical steps between those two ideas possibly possesses a hole or two, I feel. Perhaps there is some translation of the Bible in which the Ephesians are noted to clean the floors of their homes with tiny mastodons. Or the Apostle Paul goes to visit the Thessalonians in a rock enclosure on the back of an enormous pterosaur after said pterosaur says a quip of some kind. It's a living. Oh, my aching back. That's right. I have never heard of such a translation, but I sure would like to. Of course, what they actually mean to demonstrate is that the Earth is 6,000 years old, but really if you're a creationist, you have to take prehistoric animals out of the picture entirely, because there are thousands of different species of them, wave after wave of whole ecosystems, and if they all lived at once, they would jostle each other uncomfortably. But so it goes with creationists. And this is 3 times I've complained about them so far tonight. A perfect trifecta, and now I'm finished. This I swear. A larger contingent of unscientific cryptozoology is what you might call soft cryptozoology. I mean, nobody does, but I am. And you can all join me, and it will sweep America. It's not much as movements go, especially in 2017, but obviously I think America could do worse at this point than, hey, let's all think about cryptozoology for a while. Soft cryptozoology deals with creatures that are reported in modern times that don't have any pretense at all to zoological probability. Mothman, the Jersey Devil, the times when Chupacabra has wings, that sort of thing. The evolutionarily impossible and the out-and-out supernatural. And this stuff is amazing, it's loads of fun, but it's not real, not in a biological sense. Even the proponents of these things typically resort to nakedly cheap sci-fi explanations for these creatures. Space aliens, other dimensions, sometimes Satan shows up, and you just can't call it science. Very, very few papers that have won the Nobel Prize for Physics have a lot of Satan in them. But I still kind of want Mothman's goateed counterpart from the evil universe to show up sometime. Cryptozoologists who want to explain their creatures in evolutionary and ecological terms hate these guys. One of the most major groups, the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Society, pretty much has that scientific in there to warn about what they're going to put up with. I'd like to note that the skeptics are often no more rational, by the way. For example, a few years ago, this photograph, purporting to depict Nessie, started appearing online. And immediately the comment threads came alive with people insisting that it was a duck. Anyone who knew anything about ducks could plainly see that. Or the shadow of an airplane. Obviously, what kind of idiot can't see that it's the shadow of an airplane? And what this is an indistinct blob. And condescending avowals that it is clearly anything other than that are fatuous, every bit as unreasonable as the idea that it is a Nessie. In summary, humans are awful. Also, in summary, cryptozoology is the attempt to discover new sorts of animal on Earth, or the survival of old sorts, which in their being undiscovered cannot reliably be said to exist at all. So where did this begin? What is its history? This is hard to pin down. In a way, it's technically cryptozoology when you show a dog an elephant. It probably happened continuously as humans spread across the world. Okay, so you say it had a deer's head, tiny human arms, a big lizardy tail, and it jumped to get everywhere. Okay, pal, we're gonna bring you in here and you're gonna sleep it off. The prehistoric indigenous Australians had drunk tanks. Not everybody knows that. And in the so-called age of exploration, it all happened again. Europeans came to America and reported tiny bears that hung upside down from tree limbs, and capybaras, which they recorded as a kind of fish. And so on. Now, there were actually some pretty good reasons why they were so hilariously wrong about all of this. One is that these ships didn't have science officers on them. They were looking for trade routes and gold and places to put churches and maybe red owls. This is the past, you understand, where the red owls are. They didn't care. They didn't care about the animals, they weren't there for them. Another reason they got it all so wrong is that they were some morons. So none of this really feels like what we would call cryptozoology. There's no aim at animal discovery, and there's no counterpoint. Tiny upside-down bears? Wow. We do get a bit of the first thing, though, in the 1800s, with the expanding of the frontiers of science as a goal of exploration. The famed voyage of the Beagle, with Charles Darwin on board, is a famous example of this. But before this, Thomas Jefferson, famed founding father, proponent of the sciences and the separation of church and state, and slaveholder, because the world is complex and disappointing, charged Lewis and Clark with discovering new animals, and specifically asked them to keep an eye out for mammoths and mastodons. Now, this isn't as bananas as it sounds. At this point in history, Western science hadn't really figured out about extinction yet. Dinosaurs had yet to be properly described, and people were operating on the default assumption that God would not create a creature and then withdraw it from human use. But there were fossils of elephants around here, so somewhere around here, there have got to be elephants. Besides Lewis and Clark, Jefferson would send agents out to local indigenous people on the East Coast and have them ask if the native people knew anything about enormous animals with huge tusks and an arm coming out of their faces. And here's where the delightful part happened. Very frequently, the response they received was, "Oh yeah, there's lots of those. Go about 50 miles that way, you'll be swimming in the things." Amazing. It also bears mentioning that much of Jefferson's interest in finding American elephants was because of the French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, proposing the theory of American degeneracy, which stated that all American animals were just smaller, weaker versions of European animals. Well, zing. Apply cold water to burned areas. Well, Jefferson wasn't going to stand for that. Obvious nonsense with no real relationship to national pride, though it may have been. And apparently he thought that scaring up a few elephants would throw off the curve. And the odds of powerful white men being giant man babies apparently approach 1-to-1 at all times. But if Lewis and Clark ever saw any mastodons, they were uncharacteristically laconic about it. And so again, we approach cryptozoology without actually achieving it. It was around this time, however, that one of the great subjects of cryptozoology, complete with a system of sightings and then nobody believing them, came into its own. I speak, of course, of sea serpents. Now, of course, sea serpents predate the beginnings of science by a considerable amount of time. Ancient mythology is groaning with Cetuses and Tiamats and Sisyutals, but that's mythology, which is different from cryptozoology. We'll get to that in a moment. Spoiler alert. But somewhere there was a tipping point. Somewhere Western society got sufficiently excited about its mastery of worldly knowledge that when the sailors would report their serpents, which they would do incidentally because the serpents were rare and exciting, and then they would not be believed. Everybody was too busy believing that the lumps on your head indicated your personality, and that cocaine was pleasantly invigorating. Which I suppose it is, in a way. In the 19th century, there came to be a vogue for explaining sea monsters as other animals known to exist. The ancient Norse kraken, described in the old texts as a circle of enormous horns that would rise from the sea around one's ship, was decided to be a giant squid, reaching with its tentacles, which was presumably not really intended to make anyone feel better. The sea serpent reported in 1734 by Hans Egede, Bishop of Greenland, which I imagine is a post with a lot of free time, was also theorized to be a giant squid, with the main body and two fins sticking out of the water, and one of its many arms forming the apparent tail. Basically, they were super into deciding that everything was giant squids in the 19th century, is what I'm saying. Perhaps this is why giant squids are so popular in modern steampunk, just after goggles and gears that serve no purpose. But this is not Reverend Matt's Why in God's Name is Steampunk doing that science. So we will shelve that for now. In the 20th century, another non-giant snake explanation for sea serpents gained in popularity, and that was that such creatures were surviving basilosauruses, serpentine whales that went extinct 30 million years ago. Or did they? Yes. Probably yes, they did. A shame, because they're pretty good candidates for the sea serpent identity, with their most severe deficit was that they weren't flexible enough to bunch themselves up into loops in the traditional manner. But talking of the 20th century, this is of course when cryptozoology as we know it came into full flower. A large part of this is because now, at last, the age of exploration was now over, and thoroughly so. Half the reason there are even any forests anymore is that rich white men like to go out and shoot things in them. This is often called getting back to nature, and it involves high-powered rifles and sophisticated optical systems, and I guess I forget what nature is. But it has been proposed, by those who approach cryptozoology as an entirely folkloric event that it is doing much the same thing as hunters, attempting to reconnect to the natural world in a civilization that seems quite bereft of it in a weird sideways sort of way. In the case of cryptozoology, it seeks the mystery of nature in a world that seems to some too controlled, too bereft of real mystery, a world with no place for explorers anymore. Not to anyone who pays a lot of attention to science, but to some. Which is why it is largely a 20th century phenomenon, cryptozoology. Now is the time that we've got a pretty good idea of what life on Earth looks like, and now is the time that major new proposals along those lines are going to seem unreasonable. And so several of the most major cryptozoological subjects are uniquely 20th century. The Loch Ness Monster became a phenomenon in 1933 with the completion of the A82 highway on the Loch's north bank, finally opening it to anyone but Highlanders. The famous surgeon's photograph was taken in 1934, and it was, of course, a lot of hot garbage. It could be a water bird, a guy doing this. It is not useful at all as evidence, and so, of course, it becomes Nessie's primary image. This in spite of the fact that a lot of the head and neck sightings of the creature describe an altogether shorter, more rounded affair. Listen, I have a lot of opinions about Nessie, and I'm not going to get into them now because many of you have heard them, and those of you who haven't, oh, you will one day. One day everyone on Earth will know my opinions about Nessie. I promise you that. In 1951, Eric Shipton produced for the world a photo of an ape-like footprint in the snow with an ice pick to demonstrate the enormous scale. And yes, thanks for that, Eric. We all know exactly how big an ice pick is. That is super helpful. And so the world learned of the Yeti. It's had a lot going for it as a hidden animal. There are fossils of giant apes extinct fairly recently in the general area, and the Himalayas are actually a pretty good place to hide. In the con column, we have the fact that non-anecdotal evidence for the Yeti consists of the Shipton photograph and basically nothing else ever again. The word Bigfoot first appeared in the 19th century, but in 1958 a series of huge man-like footprints appeared around a construction site in Northern California, and the term gained national and international prominence. Again, as with Nessie, I have far much to tell you about Bigfoot for tonight's purposes. Soon, I must leave you. But one day I will return with Bigfoot facts. And so after all of this, in 1959, the word cryptozoology was coined. And it remained very popular for the next 2 decades, spurred on by interesting if inconclusive new photos and footage. The famous Patterson-Gimlin film in particular is practically a Rorschach test, your reaction to it telling the world more about yourself than about hairy bipedal primates. Some insist that a zipper is plainly visible. See? See it? And others insist that the walk is too smoothly inhuman to be a man in a suit, while others are certain that it is an absurd caricature of a monster walk. Study it then, and judge for yourself. Or lead a normal life with a fulfilling job and a beautiful family. One of those. Cryptozoology has declined a bit since the 1970s, though. It's certainly in no danger of going away, but interest seems to have ebbed overall. Presumably this is due to unguessable cultural factors, but a more recent decline might have a second explanation. Everyone in Christendom now carries a dang video camera around with them at all times. Claims of monsters will now demand photographic evidence. Now there is no longer any excuse. And now, of course, fakery is also much, much easier. Though, of course, though obviously this one's real. And so the recording and the control of the world that prompted cryptozoology in the first place threatens to overwhelm it. Skeptic, though I often am, it's a terrible shame, and I will always listen to your monster stories. Reverend Matt's Monster Science will return after these messages. Please go to the concessions in the lobby, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.